This is Cgtn, China Global Television Network.
Southeast Asian countries in the spotlight. Foreign ministers from Southeast Asian nations, or ASEAN, have gathered in Jakarta, Indonesia, to discuss regional affairs. Senior diplomats from China, the US, Russia, and other regional countries also took part. The theme for this year for ASEAN is ASEAN Matters, Epicentrum of Growth. At the opening plenary session, Indonesian Foreign Minister Retno Marsudi emphasized the importance of ASEAN's unity and centrality to maintain regional peace and stability. China's senior diplomat, director of the Office of Foreign Affairs Commission of the CPC Central Committee, Wang Yi, attended the meetings, reaffirming China's support for ASEAN centrality and highlighting regional integration, common security, and sustainable development. He also met with U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken the second time in a month. So what have been the key messages and takeaways? Welcome to a special edition of The Point with me, Li Xin, an opinion show coming to you live from Beijing. I'm pleased to be joined from Haikou, capital of China's southernmost province of Hainan, by Dr. Yang Yan, Director of Research Center of Oceans Law and Policy at the National Institute for South China Sea Studies. From North Carolina, the U.S., by Klaus Laris, Professor of History and International Affairs at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. From Shanghai, by Niu Haibing, Director of the Institute for Foreign Policy Studies at Shanghai Institutes for International Studies. And from Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, by Professor A. Sung Oh, Principal Advisor at the Pacific Research Center. The warmest welcome to all of you. And let me start from the region by Professor A, of course. Now, the theme of this year's Indonesia chairmanship of ASEAN is ASEAN Matters, Epicentrum of Growth. What does that tell us about the aspirations of ASEAN, and what are the main tasks the foreign ministers set down to tackle?
Well, as the topic suggests, ASEAN nowadays facing two, shall we say, huge challenges. The first one being the revitalization of ASEAN's economy as a whole. Even though ASEAN is one of the world's fastest growing region, but because it has a huge population, so sometimes this sort of growth may not be enough in keeping up with the paces of population growth in Southeast Asia. So number one, to revitalize the economy, and number two, also to perhaps re-centralize regional security matters onto ASEAN itself. ASEAN centrality has been paid lip service over the past, shall we say, decade or two, but with Indonesia leading the pack nowadays, it's perhaps time for ASEAN to reassert its centrality again. Thank you.
Exactly what does ASEAN mean by ASEAN centrality, and why do you say that it's been paid lip service, Professor A?
Well, for ASEAN to reassert itself, its centrality would entail many of its member states, for example, they would have to, for example, divert some of their national resources in order to strengthen their national defense. They would have to play more proactive role, for example, in making sure that some of the security concerns, common security concerns, such as piracy, such as trafficking of human beings and so on, would be able to tackle not only by the major powers of the world, but also by ASEAN countries itself.
Mr. Niu, let me go to you. Do you think ASEAN centrality also faced the problem of not really being implemented, but being paid lip service?
Yes, I agree with you, especially in the background of the U.S. comeback to the Indo-Pacific it has established many mini multilateral groups which focus on the regional security, economic, and other issues, which attract attention to the central role played by the ASEAN countries. And I think at this time, we have to pay more attention to the vision and demands of the ASEAN countries about their own region's development priorities and approaches to solve the problems.
One of the key outcomes of this meeting, or one of the major components of this foreign ministers' meeting, has been a meeting of the Commission of Southeast Asian Nuclear Weapon Free Zone, when they held a meeting on Tuesday expressing the disappointment that the region is still not safe from nuclear weapons. Now, China has expressed a willingness to sign a regional nuclear weapon free zone treaty, but not the other major nuclear power states. Mr. Niu, how important is that issue for ASEAN, and what is China's consideration, and what could be the consideration of other major nuclear powers not to express at least their willingness to sign up to the pact?
It's a long-term goal for the region, for the ASEAN countries to establish a nuclear weapons-free zone. It will be one of the 5 such kind of zones around the world. And at the current stage, there are many things changing, especially the conflict in the Ukraine. People talk a lot about the weapons of the nuclear weapons might be used in that conflict. And also, the U.S. has transferred its nuclear weapon technology to the regional countries around the Southeast Asia, so which gives the priority and pressure for the ASEAN countries to talking about this important issue. And China supports the goal of the ASEAN countries to establish such kind of zones, and which will be enhance the regional security environment and mutual trust. So it's quite important for other nuclear states to follow this initiative to give more stability to the region.
Mr. Laras, let me go to you. Do you think it is possible that the United States would sign up to such a treaty or protocol anytime soon?
Probably not. It's doubtful. But the treaty was signed in 1995. It came into force in 1997. Now it's well or almost 30 years later, and all nuclear powers, including China, have been rather slow in committing themselves to a nuclear zone in the Pacific, in the ASEAN countries. So I can't see that much progress will be made in the next few years. And there are all sorts of reasons.
China has expressed, China, as I just said, China has expressed its willingness to sign up on the protocol.
Absolutely. So that is progress. But of course, what did they do since 1997? Why didn't they commit themselves much earlier to that? And the question can also be asked, what about the other nuclear powers? Why is there so much hesitancy to sign up to such a treaty? Perhaps the treaty is really more symbolic than it has really something is of practical use. But that, it would do no harm if all the nuclear powers signed that treaty, clearly.
Dr. Yan, what is your understanding of the importance of such a treaty? Of course, I know you come from South China Sea Institute, but in terms of regional security, collective security, how is that really a symbolic issue of symbolic importance, or is the region really committed to having such a protocol into place?
Yes, it's indeed very important, the Bangkok Treaty. We do see that in recent years, we see that many mini multilateral mechanisms like the Quad, like the AUKUS already bring concerns to the ASEAN countries. For example, like the ASEAN countries recently, for the past 2 years, they expressed their concerns of a nuclear arms race and arms force, more involvement of the extra-regional countries in the region. Therefore, in such a background, I think the denuclearization is much more important than like 10 years before. And China has been supportive of the Bangkok Treaty for many years, and I think that is the way for China to show its genuine desire to maintain stability and peace in the region.
All right, let's focus on what China said. China's senior diplomat said during the meeting, some of the statements that China made. For instance, Wang Yi said that China has reached a consensus with Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, Myanmar, Laos, and Cambodia on building a community with a shared future. Professor A, from regional countries' perspective, what specific implications will such a status carry for these countries? What do they understand?
Well, I think from the Southeast Asian perspective, prospering together or prosperity for the region would be of utmost importance. We welcome more investment from China. We welcome more trade with China. ASEAN's trade volume with China, it's already very sizable. I think it's probably the largest in the world. So how could we further upgrade this sort of trade? For example, should we nowadays place more focus, more emphasis on trade in services in addition to trade in goods? And if we are talking about trade in services, then we will be talking about freedom of movement among all the ASEAN countries and together with China. So I have been long calling for example, visa-free travel between China and most countries of Southeast Asia. I think that is a concrete step that we could take and a very solid first step.
Well, Mr. Niu, let me go to you for the Chinese perspective. Indeed, China and ASEAN are each other's largest trading partner for the past 3 years. China is number one for ASEAN, for instance, followed by the US, EU, and then Japan. And this year, bilateral trade is expected to exceed $1 trillion. That's after the volume jumped by 15% last year over the previous year. And China is in talks with ASEAN on version 3.0 of a free trade area. So how important are they for each other in terms of economic prosperity, and how big is the potential?
As you said, the potential is huge. Especially these two sides has established the mechanism to strengthen this economic tie. Like FTA has been updated twice, and the third version of the FTP will focus on a more broad economic cooperation agenda, like our colleague from Southeast Asia has mentioned. The service trade will be one of the priorities, and also both sides will focus on the cooperation on the digital economy, the interconnectivity, the green economy. More things will be put on the table, so more resources will be there, and I think also people-to-people interaction will be there. So
do you think, well, on Thursday, the foreign ministers from China, Japan, and ROK met with their counterparts from ASEAN, and Mr. Wang Yi actually called for an increase in commercial flights between countries in the region and an orderly resumption of inbound tourism. Does that mean there may be some openings in terms of visa issuance, at least following the the disruption that we've seen over the COVID years, Mr. Niu?
Yes, there are many restrictions are still there after the pandemic. So we should do a lot of concrete works on the issues like the visa and more planes traveling to two-way, and also to quicken and strengthen the recovery of the post-pandemic economy. We have to make people more willing to travel.
Could there
especially
be
for business travel.
Yeah, could there be an arrangement for free visa arrangement among ASEAN, including China, in the near future? Is that ever possible?
Yeah, I hope so. There is a potential. There is a strong demand from the business sector, and also the willingness of the people to travel more conveniently. So for the vacations and so on, so holidays. So, but I think the China and the ASEAN countries should take the first steps and to make the Japan and Korea maybe to follow these things.
Let's keep a watch on the situation, but let's now move on to something more contentious in a geopolitical sense. South China Sea, of course, that's what I mean. The countries, China and ASEAN, agreed this week on guidelines to accelerate the completion of the Code of Conduct, or COC, for the South China Sea. Dr. Yang, you're an expert in that regard. Are the ASEAN progressing towards reaching a consensus on how to conduct themselves, and how far are we from the conclusion of the talks?
Well, actually, I think yesterday and today we do have see this very encouraging news that the COC negotiation has already finished the second reading. And I think this is a very important news to see, because our last milestone was back in 2018, when the SDNT single draft of negotiating text was reached. I think it is both China and ASEAN's common desire to reach the COC, to finalize the COC in an early date, because it is a regional rules that we established, China and ASEAN. We both established by our own for regional peace and without extra-regional countries' involvement. So this is very important, and I do feel that after the pandemic, everything's back to the right track. And currently, we have 4 working group meetings every year, and I really look forward to a future very close conclusion of the COC.
Professor Laras, U.S. Assistant Secretary of State Daniel Crittenbrink said before Secretary Blinken traveled to Jakarta that we have seen an upward trend of unhelpful and coercive and irresponsible Chinese actions in the South China Sea. Given the kind of progress or steps taken by China and ASEAN in terms of accelerating their work with the Code of Conduct, do you think the U.S. position is instrumental, really, on helping countries in the region to be on the same page?
Well, China and the United States see the South China problem from very different angles, while, as you just quoted, while the United States accuses the Chinese of acting aggressively, the Chinese accuse the United States of doing exactly that and interfering in something where they shouldn't be interfering. The progress in the conduct, the guidelines for the South China Sea between China and ASEAN has to be welcomed. Whether it will be finalized, we don't know. It was meant to be finalized last year. We are still negotiating, but there is hope that some sort of code of conduct can be finalized maybe this year. However, it also is the case that there are overlapping claims between China and 4 other Asian countries about islands, barriers, and reefs in the South China Sea. Whether the Code of Conduct can overcome these overlapping and very contentious claims, that must be seen. I think in the end, it will not be the guidelines on paper, but how that will be implemented in practice. That will really help us to see whether peace and stability can return to the South China Sea.
Dr. Yan, do you have a response for Mr. Laras' concern that whether, even if completed, the COC can help calm down or resolve the differences between China and some of its neighbors concerning the disputed island and structures?
Well, actually, first of all, and very important, I think we all need to be aware that the COC is not a mechanism to solve the dispute. However, it is, I think it's a mechanism to manage the dispute. So I do agree to a certain level of Professor Larry said that the COC is to some extent is the do's and don'ts of regional states. Therefore, I think when the COC is reached, maybe in the very near future, that the regional states can know how to do and how to behave ourselves to guarantee peace and stability in the region.
What about the disputes that are really still standing in the way, Dr. Yan? What is China's approach or vision of resolving these differences?
I think China's claim in the South China Sea, as well as China's policy of how to resolve it, is very consistent. We do think that the resolvement, the final settlement of the dispute needs to be between the claimant states and also through diplomatic methods. And I do not see the settlement could be happening in the very near future. I think it just takes time because the South China Sea dispute is the most complicated maritime dispute in the whole world, involving 5 countries, involving more than 200 features in the ocean. So it's very extremely and highly a controversial issue. Mm-hmm. But I do think that with the COC negotiation and also with the maritime cooperation projects, many of the projects are ongoing, and with many of the low-hanging fruit and also with the China-ASEAN series of meetings, both multilateral one and bilateral one, I think that we can work together to guarantee peace and stability before the settlement of the final dispute.
Well, last month, the U.S., Japan, and the Philippines conducted drills near the South China Sea. And this week, during ASEAN's foreign ministers' meeting, Japanese Minister of Foreign Affairs Yoshimasa Yahashi said, "Our region and the world are facing various challenges, such as Russia's aggression against Ukraine, unilateral attempts to change the status quo by force or coercion in the East and South China Seas." Professor A, do you perceive that Japan is involving itself more in the security affairs in the region and where they shouldn't really be in China's perspective?
Well, Japan, I think since at least a decade ago, has been trying to so-called re-normalize itself, or at least from its perspective. And that would imply that Japan would take a more proactive stance when it comes to regional security matters. We do see more Japanese involvement in security and defense matters, especially in security and defense cooperations with a number of Southeast Asian countries. Previously, some of these collaborative efforts were undertaken by the United States, but it would appear that nowadays Japan, number one, it's also taking part in some of these collaborative efforts, and perhaps there's some degree of coordination between Japan and the United States when it comes to regional security collaborations.
Is that welcome? I mean, does that make common security more in sight for countries in ASEAN? Professor A.
Well, I think it's like this. A lot of Southeast Asian countries, even though they have been growing spectacularly in terms of their economies, they have perhaps long neglected their defense or security requirements. So when Japan comes knocking, sometimes with projects, sometimes with resources, and if these resources or projects are affordable, I think some of these ASEAN countries would be quite tempted to undertake them.
Let's take a look at another development between China and the United States. As I said, Mr. Wang Yi met with the U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken for the second time in a month. Now, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of China posted this picture, which I'm showing here. I don't know whether my guests can see. But basically, Wang Yi is saying that as major countries with important influence, China and the U.S. should respect the efforts of regional countries, support ASEAN centrality, and avoid avoid bringing disputes and complex factors into regional cooperation. And this is the picture I meant, showing both sides, engaging with each other, talking to each other, Mr. Blinken showing the way forward in China, Mr. Wang looking at Mr. Blinken. Given the kind of tension and awkwardness between the two countries over the recent years, Mr. Niu, let me go to you. What do you think of, what is your take of the use of this picture by the Ministry of China, by China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs? What kind of tone is the picture and the reportage?
I think this is a very positive signal for the bilateral relationship. This is the second meeting of the two top diplomats from both sides, and they signaled that China-U.S. Senior officials' interaction and dialogue is strengthening. And also, I think they are talking a lot about the regional issue beyond the bilateral relations. This is also quite important for both countries to support a more active role of the ASEAN in the regional affairs. And third, I think this is also important for the U.S.-China relationship in the next steps. Especially, there are some substantial issues to be resolved, like to revise the guiding principles of the two countries to make the competition maybe more constructive, in a more constructive way, and also to broaden the dialogue channels from the economic diplomatic side to the security and defense sector. So there are still a lot of work to do. So I think this meeting is highly needed for the countries and the world.
Yeah. Professor Laras, on the same day, though, a U.S. Navy plane flew over the Taiwan Strait. Which signal should people take? Are they talking, or are they flexing muscles at the same? Or this is the picture of today that people have to understand.
Well, the United States views the Taiwan Straits as international waters, so they are fully entitled to fly planes over international waters. That would be the American response to that. But I would like to also say that I believe both sides, both China and the United States, at the moment are in the process of trying to improve the bilateral relationship. Both sides have recognized that it's a dead-end street to just criticize each other, to fight trade wars, to fight other wars of words, that doesn't lead to anything. So I think both sides are engaging right now. You mentioned Blinken's second visit and second meeting with Wang Li. Then we had Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, in Beijing recently. Then the new Chinese ambassador to Washington was received at the Pentagon. John Kerry is coming next week to Beijing. These are all good signs. Of course, the meetings, the talks need to lead to something. But without talking first, you will never have meetings. So I think we can be hopeful that the relationship will gradually get better. But I have to say, new restrictions are coming. The United States is imposing new technological restrictions on China about defense equipment, about artificial intelligence, about chips which are not being able to be delivered to China. That will also increase the tension between the two sides. But let's hope that the talking we have seen recently, that will be able to overcome the renewed tension, which we will also see in the near future.
Dr. Yan, very briefly, I have 20 seconds in terms of South China Sea, as China and the United States step up their engagement, at least for the time being. What do you foresee in the near future in terms of the temperature of the waters there, if you know what I'm talking about?
Yes. I do think that the United States, first of all, need to be really aware that it's not a claimant state of the South China Sea dispute, neither is it as a claimant state of the in the East China Sea. But I think that the most important thing, talking about maritime affairs between China and the United States, is still how to avoid miscalculation and misperception in terms of when it comes to a close encounter.
All right.
Yes, to avoid those tragic incidents.
We have to leave it there. Many thanks to my guests, Dr. Yan Yang, Klaus Laras, Niu Haibing, and A. Sung Oh. Thank you for your insights. With that, we come to the end of this edition of The Point with me, Lu Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle Lu Xin. In Beijing, I'll be away for 2 weeks of holidays. See you when I'm back. Meanwhile, you've got The Point and have a good time.
This is Cgtn, China Global Television Network. Live from Beijing, this is Global Watch.
Hello, it's noon in Beijing and 4 a.m. GMT. Welcome to Global Watch. I'm Pandong in Beijing. First, the headlines. Senior Chinese diplomat Wang Yi meets with ASEAN diplomats and partners on the sidelines of the ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting in Jakarta. Germany unveils its China strategy, citing a need to reduce so-called economic dependency while highlighting its desire to work together on global challenges. Ukraine received its first shipment of cluster munitions despite global concerns over the US decision to supply such type of weapons. And experts warn of rising sea levels as climate change leads to hiking temperatures around the world. We start with the ongoing Foreign Ministers meeting of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, in Jakarta, Indonesia. Besides a number of bilateral meetings on sidelines, two important events took place in the past 24 hours, namely the China-ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting and the ASEAN Plus 3 Foreign Ministers meeting. Now, for more on that, let's cross live to our correspondent, Roberlin Perba in Jakarta. Roberlin, first of all, bring us highlights of that two important multilateral meetings.
Yes, now the South China Sea was the focus on the ASEAN Plus 3 dialogue. And as we know, the South China Sea is a strategic waterway that's important, an important shipping route that's crucial for countries in the region and countries in other parts of the world as well. Now, Indonesia's Foreign Minister, Retno Marsudi, is suggesting that the dialogue can start cooperating in developing the electric vehicle ecosystem and also boosting sustainability of development. While on the Fukushima nuclear plant, contaminated water released into the waters was opposed by China, yet Japan assured that the operation will be safe. Now, while from the China-ASEAN meeting, we have China's top diplomat, Mr. Wang Yi, has stated that ASEAN-China cooperation has strengthened economic cooperation in the region. Now, for the last 2 decades, China and ASEAN have actively expanded mutual beneficial cooperation on all fronts and have successfully embarked on the right path of long-term friendships. Now, in this meet, the guidelines of a code of conduct in the South China Sea have also been agreed by ASEAN and China.
Now, Roberlin, as the gathering is still underway, what can we expect from Friday?
Yeah, so for upcoming for today, we have the East Asia Summit Foreign Ministers meeting, and Indonesia's Foreign Minister have said on this that the Indo-Pacific must not only become a net contributor of growth, but also a net contributor for peace. Now, she mentions that while there are differences, differences can be a dividing force or can be turned into strength that enriches collective efforts. And after that, we have the ASEAN Regional Security Forum as well. Back to you, Pandong.
Thank you very much. Our correspondent, Roberlin Perba in Jakarta, Indonesia. Staying with the topic, now let's take a quick look at some facts and figures of China-ASEAN relations. China has remained the largest trading partner of the ASEAN for 13 consecutive years. The latest data shows that in the first half this year, two-way trade between two sides rose by over 5% a year ago to more than 3 trillion yuan, that's about $430 billion on June the 2nd, as the Philippines became the last country to ratify the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP. The trade pact went into full effect for all 15 members, making it the world's largest free trade area. Now, also in the first half this year, China's trade with ASEAN countries accounted for over 50% of its trade with other members of RCEP. This year marks the 10th anniversary of building a closer China-ASEAN community with a shared future, and the 20th anniversary of China's joining the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation in Southeast Asia. It's also the 10th anniversary of Chinese President Xi Jinping's proposal of joint efforts with ASEAN to build a maritime Silk Road of the 21st century. Now, for more insights into ASEAN Plus 3 cooperation, let's cross live to Dr. Azmi Hassan, a political analyst based in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. Thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Hassan. So let's start with the just released the ASEAN Plus 3 statement. In it, it looks like securing regional food security is one of the top priorities for this framework. Why is this issue so important right now?
Yes, Pandang. I think the climate change and also what's happening in Ukraine demonstrate that how important is food security. And I think we have learned that the food supply chain, I think, is very, very critical. And I think it's appropriate that the ASEAN Plus 3 meeting put out this kind of gesture, but appropriate action need to be taken. But luckily, I guess, ASEAN Plus 3 other nations, I think they are part of, as you mentioned just now, RCEP. Which is, I would say, the biggest trade agreement. I think RCEP can be used as a leverage to ensure that the food supply chain is not interrupted, to ensure that the trade activity are, I would say, very fair for all the ASEAN Plus 3. So I guess we are lucky enough to have RCEP and ASEAN Plus 3 to be part of it.
Well, Doctor, we know in recent years NATO has been trying very hard to assert its influence into the Asia-Pacific and Northeast Asia. They've been trying so hard to engage countries like Japan and South Korea into their intelligence network, and they've been proposing to set up a liaison office in Tokyo. Do you think this is actually a threat to regional stability? And if that's the case, what role can ASEAN Plus 3 play in maintaining regional stability and getting the region out of external influence and interference, maybe?
Yes, truly, Pandang, that I think NATO has been creeping slowly. No doubt about that. No secret about that. But luckily, I think President Macron of France said no liaison office in Japan. I think it's a positive sign. But again, ASEAN need to play, or ASEAN Plus 3 need to play a more greater role. And as you mentioned, Pandang, just now about the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, I think it's going to be a good leverage for ASEAN Plus 3, which all 13 members are part of TAC, to use that as a leverage. And one more thing, the ongoing discussion between China and ASEAN regarding the non-aggression pact on any maritime issue. I think if you add together the TAC, the non-aggression pact under discussion, I think it could be a good leverage, a good constraint to ensure that NATO do not creep slowly into Indo-Pacific or into Asia-Pacific.
Well, Doctor, what do you make of the trade potential? And let's focus on RCEP, which is the world's largest free trade area at the moment. Do you think its potential is optimistic, especially in the face of a very weak recovery from COVID?
Yes. As a Malaysian here, I think I'm very optimistic. If you combine RCEP and the current under discussion of the ASEAN-China trade area, the so-called version 3, where this version 3 put emphasis on what we mentioned just now, the food supply chain, the food security, I think the growth within the ASEAN Plus 3, within ASEAN itself, within Asia-Pacific, if you combine RCEP plus the ASEAN-China free trade area, I think it's a very positive vibe. Even though there are problems after the pandemic, I think it's going to be a very positive growth for ASEAN Plus 3.
Thank you very much, Dr. Azmi Hassan in Kuala Lumpur. On sidelines of the ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting, senior Chinese diplomat Wang Yi met with foreign ministers of some ASEAN members and partners.
During talks with U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, Wang urged the U.S. to take concrete actions to bring relations back to the right track, including lifting unlawful and unreasonable sanctions against China. Wang Yi reaffirmed China's solemn position on the Taiwan question and demanded the U.S. to respect China's sovereignty and territorial integrity. The two diplomats also discussed Asia-Pacific issues and maritime affairs. At another sideline meeting, Wang Yi told Vietnamese Foreign Minister Bui Thanh Son that China is willing to expand mutually beneficial cooperation with Vietnam. Both stressed the high-quality construction of the Belt and Road Initiative and their cooperative partnership. Meeting with Australian Foreign Minister Penny Wong, Wang Yi said the two countries should maintain current good momentum. He hopes Australia would provide a fair, non-discriminatory business environment for Chinese enterprises. Australia's Penny Wong said good relations are in the interest of both sides. At a meeting between Wang Yi and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, both sides stressed the mission to promote world multipolarity and great democracy in international relations. Wang said China is ready to work with Russia to support ASEAN centrality.
For more insight, let's cross live to Professor Rong Ying, Vice President of the China Institute of International Studies. Mr. Rong, looking at the U.S. moves after Antony Blinken's visit to China recently, do you think the U.S. words match its deeds?
Yeah, it will take time and really actions to see whether U.S. has followed through the promises, the words, or in other words, whether U.S. has walked the talk. But the most important thing, of course, is that as we have seen, the line of communications, high-level communications, continued. We are going to have seen, certainly, I think, after this meeting, in the second one in 1 month, and there will be more coming. But as you rightly said, the most important thing is that promises, commitment have to be followed. More importantly, I think coordinations and consultations has been made on equality and mutual respect, and particularly on regional issues where I think China and the United States and the region as a whole share so many important common understanding and common interests.
Well, Professor, what do you make of the status quo of China-Australia ties? In his meeting with Penny Wong, Mr. Wang Yi said Australia would provide a fair, just and non-discriminatory business environment for Chinese enterprises. Of course, that's from the Chinese senior diplomat. So having said that, do you think the current status of the two-way economic and trade ties are healthy enough?
Well, I think it could be better. Ever since the reset of the relationship end of last year, I think it's good. We see that the bilateral relationship is developing a steady and healthy way. But there are a lot of noises, there are a lot of concerns, particularly on the question of trade and also, I think, to some extent, people-to-people interactions. But as we know that the relationship, trade and economic relationship between China and Australia has been very much of great potential and a huge complementarity. To capitalize that, to give full play of that, Australia in particular really needs to create a favorable, fair and environment for Chinese business community, Chinese investment. Unfortunately, there are growing concerns and there are some remaining concerns that has yet to be addressed. And this is why I think Director Wang Yi has made a point, and the hope that Australia will heed his advice and follow through their commitment they made to the Chinese side.
Well, Professor, we'll be getting back to you very soon. Still on diplomacy, but now we turn to China-Germany ties. Germany has issued a strategy paper for relations with China. The document points to a so-called systemic rivalry with China and a need to reduce risks of economic dependency. It highlights Berlin's desire to work with Beijing on global challenges such as climate change. In response, the Chinese embassy in Germany said viewing China as a competitor and systemic rival does not accord with reality, nor does it benefit either side's interests. Trent Murray has more details from Berlin.
This is a strategy we've been waiting now for several months. It was finally unveiled today, all 40 pages of it. This is very much Berlin's new blueprint, in its view, for its relationship with its top trading partner, China. Now, we know, of course, that this report focused heavily on economic ties, given those trade links. On the question of economic ties, the strategy says that economic and trade relations remain an important element of bilateral cooperation with China. But on that question of systemic rivalry, the report says that this systemic rivalry is reflected in the fact that Germany and China have different concepts of the principles governing the international order in important areas. Now, we know, of course, Chancellor Olaf Scholz, when this report was launched, again spoke heavily about those economic ties, but he said that, frankly speaking, in his view, Germany needs to be careful that it's just not too dependent on any one trading partner. He said in a tweet, the goal is not to decouple from China, but we want to avoid critical dependencies in the future. Now, there were areas in there as well where Berlin said there were disagreements in certain policy areas. Very much this report trying to strike that balance between maintaining those strong economic ties, but also understanding that there are areas of disagreement. Some of those, according to this strategy, include disinformation, intellectual property rights, peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait, and the application of universal human rights. Roughly an hour after the strategy was released, the German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock gave a keynote speech on Germany's relations with China. Let's have a listen to what she had to say.
We can't ignore the huge Chinese market, and we don't want to. But at the same time, it is equally true that the Chinese market also needs the European one. Therefore, we cannot be indifferent to the tensions around Taiwan. A military escalation would also be a danger for millions of people worldwide, and therefore also in our country.
Well, not long after it was released, we got a statement from China's embassy here in Germany. I will read that to you in full. The embassy says that forcibly de-risking based on ideological prejudice and competition anxiety will only be counterproductive and artificially intensify risks. The embassy goes on to say that it hopes Germany views China's development rationally, comprehensively and objectively, and that many of the challenges facing Germany have not been caused by China. Now, one thing I will say is that there is very much an overarching theme in that strategy, that even in there are areas that are agreement or areas where there are disagreements, that what is really fundamental is dialogue and communication, and making sure that those channels of communication remain firmly open between Berlin and Beijing, of course, to avoid any sort of misunderstandings or miscalculations on some of these key geopolitical issues.
Professor Rungi, let's talk about this German document. Let's start with wording, actually, calling China a, quote, systemic rival and advocating for so-called reducing economic dependency on China. Do you think this is actually a repetition of collective West's rhetoric of so-called de-risking? And looking at this document in whole, do you think it's a little bit arrogant?
Yeah, there's a lot of problems with this so-called China strategy, even though I think Germany is talking about the first ever sort of a strategy for China. And we have seen that not only the wordings, but also I think the thinkings behind is problematic in the sense that it does not conform the reality, but also I think problematic in terms of its thinking and approach towards China. I think it is true. China and Germany have differences in terms of, their perceptions of the world and their perceptions, thinkings on governance, and also I think in terms of the level of development and so on and so forth. That's the reality. I think China does not want to deny that. But the most important thing, if you look at the past 50 years and more of interactions, the principle or the pragmatic way to manage these differences by seeking seeking common ground for differences and based on principle of mutual respect and win cooperation is the right way. We have more difficulties, we have more challenges, and I think we have more responsibility. China and Germany are two important economies with, I think, play a very important role in not only in terms of their bilateral development, but also in the region and the world as large.
Well, talking about responsibilities, I'd like to follow up on that so-called reducing economic dependence on China. How can the German government explain this to big names like Volkswagen, BMW, and BASF?
I think the relationship, the trade and economic relationship between China and Germany is the result of reality, simply because I think there are huge potentialities and complementarities, and business community very much, I think, have benefited from that reality, and in the past decades, because of the efforts of that, it has benefited not only the two economies, China and Germany, but also the region as a whole. Focusing too much on the so-called dependency or make this as an issue, I think run the risk, not only turn in the risk of not objective to the reality, but more importantly, as the world, as the West in general, are very much focusing on the securitization, geopoliticalization, or even the weaponization of trade and economic issues. That, in the end, is going to damaging the healthy development of the relationship, trade and economic in particular, but more importantly, I think bring more problems to the region and the world. After all, that is, I think, China and Germany are big economies. That, after all, I think this is the responsibility I'm referring to, and this is the responsibility I think, indeed, China and Germany should shoulder for the sake of, overall stability. We're talking about the supply chain, we're talking about economic recovery in the post-COVID, and we're talking about uncertainty and instabilities. I think what China and Germany should do is provide more sense of stability and more sense of positive energy in this world.
Thank you very much, Professor Rong Ying in Beijing. You're watching Global Watch on Cgtn. Coming up, Ukraine received its first shipment of cluster munitions after a controversial decision by the Biden administration to supply such weapons. And the UN says dozens of bodies are recovered from a mass grave in West Darfur as Sudan's neighbors look for a solution to the crisis.
Images may appear to be identical, but looks can be deceiving. The difference is not always obvious. It has to be discovered. There are always different sides to a story. We put the focus on the details. To see more, to understand better. Cgtn. See the difference.
Now we turn to the Ukraine crisis. Ukrainian officials say Russia launched drone attacks on the capital Kiev for the third consecutive night. Officials in Kiev say 20 Russian drones and 2 cruise missiles were shot down on Thursday. Meanwhile, a Ukrainian military spokesperson says his country has received a first shipment of cluster munitions following a very controversial and globally concerned decision by the Biden administration to provide such weapons. Stephanie Fried has more details.
This is the third successive night of drone strikes. The first night, 28 were launched, 26 intercepted. The second night, 15 launched, 11 intercepted. And then overnight last night, 20 that Ukraine says, the military says they intercepted all of them. Damage in Kyiv, several people injured, not quite sure if a person who was killed at the site of one of the drone strikes was killed because of that or something else. Conflicting reports there. But there seems to be a pattern. There was linkage certainly to the NATO summit with the other drone strikes. But overnight, let's say last night, now it seems like more, again, like a pattern. And also you noted these cruise missiles, the Caliber missiles. Ukraine's military also saying that they were launched from the Black Sea onto the city of Mykolaiv. And it's unclear. It seems that they were intercepted as well. So it seems that Ukraine's military, they are pridefully saying that their success rate in interception is quite high. The U.S. pledged as part of an $800 million weapons package to Ukraine. Part of that was the cluster munitions, and that was less than a week ago. So for now, the announcement to be forthcoming that the cluster munitions have arrived, very speedy. Why are they controversial? Because they're bomblets that when they drop as bomblets, they spread out. And it's not specific, not precise in targeting. They often have about up to a 40% rate of not exploding, which means later unsuspecting people may come across them and be harmed or killed. Nonetheless, this, Ukraine says, will give it the advantage right now in the current campaign.
China's permanent representative to the UN has accused NATO of expanding its boundaries and provoking confrontation and slammed the military alliance as the real troublemaker.
NATO claims to be a regional organization, yet it's breaking its own geographic boundaries to push into the Asia-Pacific, undermining regional and global security. NATO claims to be a defensive alliance, yet it's encouraging members to increase spending, conducting military activities across the globe, overstepping and expanding boundaries, and provoking confrontation. NATO claims to defend rules-based international order, yet it repeatedly violates international laws and basic norms governing international relations, and interferes in other countries' internal affairs. It has a reputation for provoking wars, bombing diplomatic facilities, and killing civilians. Certain member states are pursuing double standards in promoting the nuclear sharing arrangement, which only exacerbates regional tensions. Numerous facts like this have shown that NATO is the real troublemaker.
The UN says at least 87 bodies have been recovered from a mass grave outside West Darfur state capital, Al Janina. The victims were allegedly killed by Sudan's paramilitary Rapid Support Forces about a month ago. Meanwhile, a summit of Sudan's neighbours has presented a new initiative to end the conflict in Sudan. The event, hosted by Egypt, brought together leaders from 7 African countries, along with the chiefs of the African Union and the Arab League. The meeting comes as fighting in Sudan is entering its 4th month. Yasser Hakim reports.
In their keynote speeches, these summit leaders collectively warned of the situation in Sudan and the urgent need to reach a permanent ceasefire to protect the country and its people.
Like any conflict, the consequences are catastrophic on the civilians, and it forces them to be displaced, whether inside or outside Sudan.
Our sisterly nation of Sudan is bleeding. The moment in 2020 we had all celebrated, which signaled a new beginning for a democratic and a stable Sudan, has now vanished.
After a closed session, the African leaders endorsed an Egyptian initiative announced in the final declaration. It includes establishing a committee of the foreign ministers of the 7 neighbors. Their role is to present a practical and effective plan to achieve a permanent ceasefire in Sudan, conduct direct talks with Sudanese sides to outline a roadmap for peace in coordination with the African Union and Arab League, adopt an effective mechanism that will limit the impact of Sudan conflict on its neighbors. The first meeting of this committee will be in Chad. The initiative did not include the deployment of a peacekeeping force in Sudan, a proposal rejected by Sudan's government at the IGAD summit this week. The final statement confirmed the need to maintain the sovereignty and unity of Sudan, and that the neighbors should lead the way to a successful resolution.